Well, hello and welcome. I'm Peggy Joque Williams, and I'm here to talk about how to have fun with the research that you do with your genealogy. I'm going to talk about how I came to write my books that were inspired by my ancestors, and then I'll talk about ways that you can write your ancestral stories. And I'll show some examples from different genres, and I'll give some tips and suggestions to think about as you develop your stories. So I have written 2 historical fiction novels, but before that, I co-wrote and self-published 2 mystery novels. I wrote on the Road to Death's Door and On the Road to Where the Bells Toll with my sister-in-law, Mary Joy Johnson. But today what I'm going to talk about are the 2 mystery novels I wrote. Courting the Sun is set in 17th century France in the court of Louis XIV, and it was very loosely inspired by my own ancestors. And I'm going to tell the story of how that happened in just a minute. Braving the Dawn is my new book that comes out in January, and it's a sequel to Courting the Sun. And Braving the Dawn more closely reflects the life that my ancestors lived, even though it's still fictional and not exactly about any of my ancestors. I do have handouts, and I'll leave some here at the library in case anybody would like to see them. So everything started, writing my novel started with my fascination with genealogy. And way back in 1976 is when I first started exploring my family history and did research in libraries. Back then you had to do everything either in person or through the mail. And I took a break as I was raising my family and working. But then in about 2015, I got interested again. And I got into the world of genealogy, and it had changed so much, mainly due to Ancestry and other websites like that, that it was amazing how easy it became to research my family history. There are many more resources now: MyHeritage, Family Research, GeneNet, Family Tree, DNA, lots of others. So one of the things I discovered as I was doing my family history, I'm very, very heavily French-Canadian, and I found out that there was a group of women back in the late 1600s that are today called the Filles du Roi, or Daughters of the King. And the story behind that is that King Louis XIV very much wanted to have a colony of his own in the New World, and like England had and like Spain had. And the only thing that he had over there in the area that is Canada today, where he had a lot of soldiers, he had fur traders. There were a few farmers and farm families, but scattered and not very many. And in order to develop a colony, he came up with an idea. And in 1663, he started recruiting young women from the ages of about 15 to 25. And he told them that if you will go over and marry my soldiers and the fur traders and any of the unmarried farmers or other men that are there, I will pay your passage over. I'll give you money for a dowry. I'll give you a trousseau. And I will even give you a bonus for having babies. So I'm talking now about how I came to write my histories novels based on, loosely inspired by my own family history. And so King Louis XIV recruited these women. In a 10-year period, about 750 young women took him up on his program and went from France to Canada, and they did indeed marry the soldiers, they married the fur traders, they married the men that were there. Louis required that the men get married, and the program was very successful. Quebec grew, Montreal grew, all the little villages in between. And I found out that I am descendant from about 23 of these women. They are my 7th and 8th great-grandmothers who went from France to Canada. So while I might find my ancestors' lives to be very fascinating, I realized that others might not. So I created stories that I felt would be of interest to many others. Stories with real background characters and real setting, but fictional main characters and her fictional life. I could have chosen one of my own ancestors to focus on, but I decided to make it more general and just kind of have it be representative of my ancestors. So I asked the question, what if the young woman, the fille du roi in my novel, wasn't just any young woman who was part of the program, or wasn't even part of the program, but she was an actual but fictional daughter of King Louis XIV. What if she was a bastard daughter but didn't know it? And so I created a young woman who I named Sylvienne, and I placed her in the town where one of my ancestors lived. It's Amiens, France, and that's what the pictures are. And what it looks like today. And I started setting a scene for her. These are just pictures I found on the internet, but she lives in a cottage with her mother and 2 servants that she has a relationship with. They're more like an aunt and uncle to her than servants. And I thought, well, what if on the other side of the hedge was a manor house or a chalet that she's noticed and she spies on and she dreams of having a big house of her own. And in fact, the smaller cottage would be the gardener's cottage for that house. And the woman who lives in the big manor house is Madame du Barry, who is the lover of Sylvienne's Uncle Claude. So that's going to set up some interesting and intriguing things going on. Then I researched Louis XIV, the king who sponsored the fille du roi, and I researched his life, his wife, his mistresses, his brother Philippe, and Philippe's wives and lovers. And I did a lot of research about Paris during the time in the 1670s and Versailles. And as I did that research, I began to populate my story. And on the right up here, you will see the real historical figures. Louis XIV, his mistress, I pronounce it Athenay, but in French it would be more like Athenay. Philippe is his brother, and his wife at the time was Henriette. Philippe ended up having a second wife after Henriette died. And on the left are my fictional characters. So I have Sylvienne kind of in the center, her mother Isabel, her friends Perrette and Catherine. I don't think I have them all up there. I have a servant kind of woman, Tati, and then Etienne is the love interest. And these are just pictures I took from the internet. They're portraits, except for Etienne. I had AI construct that one. So I populated my story with some real figures and some fictional figures. And then, for the setting, this is a map of what Paris looked like at the time of my story. And it was it was actually one of the, Paris and London were the 2 largest cities in Europe at the time. About, I want to say 500,000 people. And I love maps. So I found this great map, and when I have it on PDF, I can go in really close and see the streets and things like that. And I have some other maps where I can see the names of the streets and everything. And then Versailles is a very important element in the story. And this is where Sylvienne meets her fate. She gets in trouble. She has a great time at first, and she meets people, and she goes to balls and dances. But then eventually she gets in trouble. And by the end of the story, she has to flee France. But that's actually not the end of Sylvienne's story. That's when I started writing the second book, Braving the Dawn. And that's when I take Sylvienne from France across the ocean, and she's on a ship with a group of young women that would become the Filles du Roi, and she travels to Quebec with them. And I never consider her as being one. She's very much a fictional character, and I have her as being a daughter of the king, so I didn't really make her one of the Filles du Roi. She's sort of adjacent to them. And in book 2, then the process starts all over. I had to research everything I could about Quebec, the life and the times of Quebec. At the time of this story, it was maybe about 1,500 people. I had to create some new characters. I kept a couple of the characters from the old book and brought them over. But then I created some new characters. I used some real historical figures and lots of fictional figures. The thing about this new book, Braving the Dawn, and this is the one coming out in January, is this more closely reflects the experience my ancestors had. None of my ancestors lived the life that Sylvienne lived in France. None of them went to court, as far as I know. And none of them were, related to or daughters of the king. But once she gets to Canada, then I used a lot of the things that I learned about my own family members. So there are members of the militia in Canada, and some of my 7th and 8th great-grandfathers were members of the militia, the regiment that came over from France. There's an encounter with the Iroquois in the book, and some of my ancestors had encounters with Iroquois, not the same kind that I fashioned, but even worse encounters. I used various nations of Indians that were in the area at the time, and wanting to do honor to my own, I have Ojibwe ancestry. And while they didn't live in Quebec to my knowledge, I have them some in the story just to give honor to them. So then I want to talk about what you can do if you want to write about your ancestors, and if you have done a lot of research and would like to create stories or write real stories about them. So what I'm going to do is show you some genres and some examples of people who've done it, and then we'll talk about how you can go about doing it. So here's some examples of people who have written nonfiction books about their ancestors. And the one, Jean Chevalier, Filles du Roi, that's a book that I actually own. I met the author, and at the time I met her, I didn't realize that the woman in this book, she is one of the Filles du Roi who came from France to Quebec, is also my ancestor. So it turns out I'm related to the author, but at the time I met her, I didn't know that. But it's a nonfiction book, so it talks about what she knows about her, what research she did. It doesn't make up like dialogue or a story. It goes through the facts and presents it that way. Some other examples, World Travelers, the one up here, was written by Jennifer Allard, and it's subtitled The Escapes of My Grandpa Lee's Family. And it's an immigrant story of a family that goes to South Africa. It was independently published by a Canadian author. The Pattons is the personal history of the Patton family, the General Patton and then his family, written by one of his descendants. And Broken Promises is the story of a Jewish family in Germany. And it was, so some of these books were self-published, some were published by small presses, some may have been picked up by larger ones. And these would all be in the nonfiction realm, telling the story, going to primary sources, maybe having journal entries or things like that. You can also write family histories that are true that would be more for posterity, for the family itself. It doesn't always have to be like a commercial biography. So the Black Family Who Built America, that's a book that's available on Amazon. And it talks about the enslavement of the family in the mid-1800s, and then eventually the family becoming free and owning an architectural company that designed the John F. Kennedy International Airport, and a lot of other things like that. It's publicly available. Some people might like it. Beyond the Family. The Mollenhoff Family Odyssey was a book that was written by David Mollenhoff, and I edited it, and he chose not to put it on Amazon. He had copies printed by a local printer. He brings them to family reunions. He gives them out to his family. So the point here is you can do it for commercial purposes, or you can do it just for your own family. I actually wish that David had put it on Amazon because he did such a good job with the story of the family coming from Sweden to the Midwest that I think a lot of people would use it as a resource, even if they weren't part of that family ancestry.
Is that a sizable book, or more like a pamphlet? Or?
No, it's a hardcover book. I've got a copy at home. It's like, yeah, yeah. It loads of photographs in it, but he used primary sources, and he tracked this family and why they left and what happened after they got here, and he did such a great job. So yeah. So you can also do writing that would just be, it doesn't have to be a book, it could be a family webpage. Substack, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a forum now that's kind of like blogging, but it sends out your blog as a newsletter, and it's become very popular. And so I had some examples here. There's a Don Taylor Generations, that was just a family website. Frank Hodgkins, and everything here is should be on the handout I gave you. Frank Hodgkins, that's on a website. The Next Gen Genealogy, and one of them, I think it was the Next Gen Genealogy, collected some of their writings and put them into a book called Beads in a Necklace. It's kind of an ensemble of writings. But the other ones, I think, are just exclusively on the web for their family or for other people who are interested in their research. You can also write for magazines or your own blog articles. So the examples I have here, The Irishman Who Begot a Line of French Canadians and Finding My Royal Ancestry, those were on my own blog. I send them out in my newsletter, but they're accessible on my webpage. And the Delta Historian, that is a newsletter for the, up in the UP, one of the counties, Delta County. Their historical society puts out a very nice, comprehensive newsletter, and my brother enjoys writing for them. He doesn't get paid for that, but he loves the research. And it's our own family that gives him ideas. So for instance, I think in this one, he was writing about when we were growing up in the little town of Escanaba, there was a small, very small potato chip factory. And my dad sold the potato chips to stores and restaurants and things like that. So he did a whole history on this potato chip factory that people were very familiar up there with that line of potato chips. He's currently working on one on prohibition up in the UP, and I think the reason that interested him is our grandfather owned a bar in the little town of Garden on the Garden Peninsula. And so he writes articles that are jumping off points from what we experienced or our family experienced, and then he does a lot of research about it, and just something he enjoys. You can use your family history to write children's books. Again, they could be nonfiction, like with adult books, but these two examples are both fictional examples. And these, I believe, are picture books, but they could be chapter books. And Always Olivia was written by Carolivia Heron and was illustrated by Jeremy Tugeot. And the story is that Carol Olivia listens as her great-grandmother relates the story of how their Jewish family moved from place to place throughout history to escape persecution, and then how they ended up in the United States. Dalton's Dream by Paula Ruth Jones. The premise is that Dalton Colwright never expected a simple family history book to change his life. But when the tech-savvy 12-year-old drifts off to sleep, he awakens in 19th century Tennessee, face-to-face with his own ancestor, John Knox Bain. Thrust into a world without electricity, running water, or modern technology, Dalton must navigate life on a pioneer farm where every day is a lesson in resilience, gratitude, and survival. So this author took a character from the family history and a setting, and then took a modern-day child and time-traveled that child back there. So that's kind of a clever way to deal with family history, family lore. You can write essays, you can write short stories, you can write poetry. These three books are all examples of poetry that are based on the poet's ancestors. So Kwame Alexander, the one in the middle, wrote Light for the World to See. He's a black author, a very popular poet. Brenda Cardenas, who wrote Trace, is the current Wisconsin Poet Laureate. She was born in Milwaukee. She writes about migration, about transcultural identity and loss, connection, dreams, and aging. I was at a conference where she read some of her poetry, and it was very much anchored in her family and in her ancestors, and very, very powerful poetry that just draws you in. And then The African Slave's Journey, Poems of My Ancestors by Gloria Aldenette Player. And so again, you can think outside the box. It doesn't have to be the strict story of your family. It could be something that inspires you about them. And of course, there's historical novels, which is what I wrote when I did mine. And these are just examples I found. The one up in the corner up here, the Allards, is written about the same group of people, the Filles du Roi, that traveled from France to Canada. And he follows a young woman and a young man that traveled. And he has a whole series of books, so he takes it from generation to generation that way. Let's see, Genealogy, the one up in the top by May Wood, was inspired by 100-year-old love letters of the author's great-grandmother. That's always fun. I know some authors who are doing that, and it's pretty cool to use that as your inspiration. 100 Sweet Promises, that's down under the Allards. A family secret is revealed 40 years before by a grandmother to her grandson, and it's the tale of the author's grandfather, a famous composer who on the eve of World War I travels from Persia to Russia to study classical music. And while he's there, he falls in love with a Romanov princess, a forbidden love. And it's based on a true story set against the backdrop of the final days of Imperial Russia. The Foundling is the story of two friends raised in the same orphanage whose loyalty is put to the ultimate test when they meet years later at an institution. And it's based on the true story of the author's grandmother. My Mary is actually published by my same publisher, and it's the story of her grandmother, who was one of a group of children called the British Home Children. And they were children, a lot of orphans, but children of indigent mothers in England who were sent from England over to Canada. And this went on for about a 100-year period. And I became interested in that one because my husband's grandfather was also a British home child who was abandoned by his mother and his grandmother, and then sent to an orphanage, and then sent on a ship with a whole lot of other children. And he was sent to Canada, and he was taken in by a farmer in Ontario province, and worked sort of as an indentured. He was never really adopted, and I don't know that he was indentured to the point where he couldn't leave, because he did eventually leave, and he eventually came to the U.S. And the whole thing about the British home children, if you know anything about the orphan train children that went from the east to the west, this is Canada and England's version of it, except they sent them across the Atlantic. Let's see. Stumbling Stones by Alice Heppenheimer is about, or Alice, it's by Bonnie Bushman, but her ancestor, Alice Heppenheimer, defies her family's expectations to pursue her dream of becoming a fashion designer. And What Remains is Hope is in 1930s Germany and based on real lives of four cousins as close as siblings. So these are all fiction novels. And some were self-published, some were published by small independent presses. Occasionally one might end up being published by one of the major ones. So if you want to write about your own ancestors, how would you go about doing that? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the first thing is you want to focus on one individual or one branch or strand of your family. What one of the authors who did the fictional, the Allards, did was he started with one couple and he talked about how they met, how they went from France to Canada, how they got married and that sort of thing. And then in his next book, he talked about the next generation. So he didn't try to do it all in one. Because I decided on writing fiction, I wrote about women who represented my 7th and 8th great-grandmothers. But as I said earlier, none of them lived the life that my character lived in France. I just wanted to have a really fun setup. But then when I took them to Canada, it's still very fictional. None of them lived that exact life, but they all had similar experiences. Decide who your audience will be. So for me, I wanted broad publication. I'd written other books, and I like having, books out there. But some people might say their audience is only their extended family. I'm getting ready to start a new kind of blog on the Substack medium, where I'm going to be focusing on some sort of genealogical mysteries in my family line. And I thought it would be fun to put it out there in case any of my extended family maybe some cousins I don't even know would like to do it, or if other people are interested in my research. So I'll put it out there for the public and see who decides they want to, to take a look at it. And that was inspired by a woman who's a professional genealogist. And she did a series on this Substack proving her line back to Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I've done enough genealogy that I've traced my line also back to Eleanor of Aquitaine. The professional genealogist has on hers very specific proofs and evidence that goes all the way back. I'm an amateur genealogist, so when I do one that's similar to that, I'll have my proof and evidence to what I call the gateway ancestor, the woman who came from France to Canada, who was a very minor nobility. And historians have traced that woman, her name is Anne Couvent, they've traced her ancestry back to a number of kings and Eleanor of Aquitaine, that sort of thing. And so what I did was I have proof up to Anne Couvent. Then I went to Wikipedia, or I used what the historians had for her line, and then when they got to the end of what they did with certain kings, I went to Wikipedia and found out who was that king's parent, who was that king's, and took it all the way back to Charlemagne, to William the Conqueror. But in no way is it professional like how a professional genealogist would do. But I think it would be fun to have that out there, maybe on a Substack, and just make it very clear that it's an amateur's work, not a professional's. So decide who your audience will be. Decide on fiction versus nonfiction, and maybe if you're the kind of person who likes poetry, that's a perfectly okay thing to do. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And like I said, my brother just enjoys the research and doing it for a local, the newsletter of the local historical society. So you can, decide on that. Whether you go fiction or nonfiction, but particularly for fiction, you want to find the dramatic element that drives the story. So for me, in my first book, it was Sylvian's desire to marry somebody very wealthy. She wanted to live in a big house like the one that was next to her. But the story goes through an arc, and she ends up getting banished from France. So maybe the dramatic element has to do with another reason for somebody's emigration, or it has to do with a child out of wedlock, or it has to do with a love story told in letters. Create a timeline of events in your character's story. So whether it's going to be fiction or nonfiction, you want to lay out what are the events that are important to the dramatic element. And then you research and build your story world, whether it's going to be fiction or nonfiction. It'll take a lot of research either way. People who read historical fiction, if you make errors in the setting or the real characters, there will always be somebody who knows and will call you on it. So what I do is in my author's note, I put what I know to be real, and then I put where I used literary license and let people know that I, varied from the historical element that way. But people will still catch me on something. For writing historical fiction, though, creating that world is, to me, part of the fun of it. So some additional things to think about. Is there a theme that you want to address? So emigration and immigration are often part of the story because that's what our ancestors went through, but not always. It could be the building of a business or an empire. It could be the love story of somebody set. A friend of mine found some love letters of her ancestors here in Dane County area. and she's working on a book for that. So there's no movement of the characters other than when they finally come together and get married and establish their own home. But the story should have some sort of an arc. And even if it's nonfiction, you want to have it start somewhere and move somewhere, have a bit of a purpose to it. And definitely in fiction, you want to have an arc to it. And in my first book, Courting the Sun, I knew that I wanted her to have to go to Canada. In the end of the book, she's given a choice by the king because she did something so egregious that people want her head. And so he said, okay, I'll give you two choices. You can go into a convent or you can go over to New France, to my colony. And she abhorred the idea of going into a convent. So she didn't like the idea of going to New France either. That's kind of a running mini theme throughout the book is, why are these women doing that? She has a friend who goes over and she's just like, why would you do that? But she takes what she believes to be the least of two evils. And your main character should have her own arc. And the arc of my main character really shows up in the second book because she's learned some things about love and loss and dreams and be careful what you wish for and that sort of thing. And so over the two books, you see a lot of change in her. Sometimes a character will have what we call a misbelief. So for Sylviane, her misbelief was that she would be happiest if she could live in a big house, if she could be wealthy. And in the end, she finds out, well, not till the second book, she finds out that that's not always the case. In the second book, she's determined she's never going to marry again. And she doesn't want anything to do with men. And that's a misbelief because that changes as well. She also believes she wants to return to France. She's determined she's going to find a way to go back. She's going to save money and go back. And things keep pushing her farther away from being able to go back. And then at the end of the second book, she has to make a choice, whether she's going to stay or go back. You want to put obstacles in the way of your character's goals. They should have goals and then obstacles to those goals. You want to create dramatic tension. Maybe your character will achieve a goal, maybe not. In the first book, Sylviane did not achieve her goal. Well, she did up to a point, and then it went sour on her. And in the second book, she achieves a goal that she didn't realize was her true path in life, and that is to find her soulmate. You want to add historical and social context to your story. And so you can create a timeline of events, world events, that affect the character. So when I was writing my historical fiction, I needed to know when was Louis born because it had to do with when he had an affair with Sylviane's mother and how old Sylviane is and when did the Filles du Roi travel? And, I wanted things within the actual time frame. And in the second book, I looked at who were the characters, who was the governor of Canada at the time, who was what they called the intendant, which was the financial and judicial governor of Canada. When did certain things happen? There was a treaty with the Iroquois. When did that happen? How big was Canada? And one of the things I found out, because Quebec has a wall around it that you can, climb up a little portion of it. And I assumed that wall would have been in existence then, and I found out it wasn't constructed until a couple of decades after my story. But they did have a wood palisade. So, I needed to account for the fact that it wasn't the big stone wall. They had a convent there that took the girls in off the boat, and what was the convent like? And the convent's still there. There was a hospital there in Quebec, and that hospital is still in operation. It's grown, And one of my ancestors is in the records of being a patient in that hospital. So I made sure that that was there. So looking at, what in the community, what in the world was going on, and weaving the events of the time into the story. And how do those events, thank you, affect the characters? So, one last tip is to source everything that you find, everything that you use. I just keep a record of, on a separate document. A friend of mine who writes historical fiction will actually put little footnotes in as she goes along, and then she takes them out, before she's getting ready to send it to the publisher. But it's really easy to forget what you made up versus what's real. And also, you might be a little hazy on a fact, and you want to be able to go back and clarify it. So source everything, keep track of everything. And remember that a record alone is not a story. It's the connection that you make between the documents. It's the relationships that people have with other people, and what happens with their goals and their dreams, and how those come to fruition or not. It's not that what happened that makes a compelling story. It's what the people involved feel while it's happening. And that is easier to do in fiction. You can do it in nonfiction if you have journals, diary entries, letters, things like that, because then you can use their real words to back it up. So, oops. Oh, the last slide didn't come out. Oh, no, there it is. Okay. So I do have a newsletter. If you're interested, my website is peggywilliamsauthor.com. And do you have any questions?
I've appreciated this last portion on tips and strategies and additional thoughts, because I have a few different stories of relatives going through my mind. I've done a little bit of work on short story writing, and when you mentioned the art, but I just really appreciated all those tips.
Yeah.
And also, I'm just thinking, as you've talked about the research you've done, in one way, it must be somewhat easier to get at the information you want through Google and Wikipedia versus 50 years ago having to go to the local library and hopefully they could get some of the documents.
Yeah. So, I had been to France a couple times,
Okay.
but it was a very long time ago. And I was doing the bulk of the work just before and during COVID. So I relied on the internet heavily. And, you can get maps and look close. You can get inside buildings, that sort of thing. It's not the same as being there. I've been to Quebec. We took a boat ride because I wanted to feel the wind coming as we went along the river. And we toured the city. There's parts of old Quebec that are still very old and, puts you in the feel of it. So, firsthand gives you something you don't have, otherwise. But, there's so much more you can do for research now. I use a lot of books. I still go to the library. I still get books out of the library. I've found books on the clothing of the period. I found books on food of the period, furniture of the period. Sometimes I find that online, but I also have books with that. And
do you use the historical library up in Madison at all? Or is that not useful to your...
I have used it for my genealogy. I have not recently used it. I know they have some books that I wanted to get my hands on and just couldn't get over there to do it, just time sorts of thing. But they do have good resources there. And there's a section of them where you can go in, especially if you have family and if there's any like documents and artifacts there, you can handle some of the things. You know, I took a tour of it once. When I was teaching, they had a tour for teachers, I think it was. And I was amazed that they opened a box of like letters and receipts and things from, I want to say, La Follette, Robert La Follette. And I mean, we had to put on gloves and stuff, but we could literally touch these things. And if you can touch something that somebody years ago, hundreds of years ago, when we went to Montreal, I have an ancestor there that dug the first water well. And there's a fountain in his honor. Now, the fountain isn't exactly where the water well, it's about maybe 100 yards. But, you know, there's a plaque there. And I had my husband drink from it while I took pictures. But also, there's a bank right in the center of Montreal that is on the property of one of my ancestors. And he was the first property holder of that property before the bank was built. And there's a plaque there. And the churches are so old that you go into these churches and your ancestors were baptized there or married there or buried there. So it's pretty amazing when you can do it in person.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both. And for anybody listening.